Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to the Cambridge Cycling Campaign's hustings on cycling issues for the Cambridge City constituency. Delighted to have four of our candidates along for tonight. We've got Rupert Reid, standing for the Green Party, Tony Fernando. Standing for the Conservative Party, Julian Hooper, standing for the Liberal Democrats, and Daniel Zeitler, standing for Labour. Before we get started, on everyone's seat is a leaflet for the Reach Ride Fair. This is on the May Day Bank Holiday Monday. It's our annual ride to the 800-year-old fair at Reach. This ride is suitable for everyone of all ages. I think we've had children as young as 7 riding on their own bikes, and children, babies as young as a few weeks being carried in trailers and in box bikes and all sorts of matters. Those that have been before, please note we are going to be leaving a little bit earlier than in previous years. This is to accommodate the special arrangements needed to get the mayor to the fair. She will be joining us, but it requires a little bit extra work, if you know Jerry. So we will be aiming to leave to actually depart from the Guildhall at 9:30. Okay. So, I think to kick off, Martin, would you like to ask one on standards, just to get us kicked off, seeing as you wanted one on standards? I've got a big sheaf of questions. If I get through all of these, we'll go for more from the floor, but we've got some that we definitely want to get through.
Thank you very much all for coming, and so I'm Martin Nixon, I'm the liaison officer of the campaign. One of the things that the cycling campaign community across the UK has been pushing for over the last 5 years is the introduction of national standards set at top level to which all local authorities should adhere. The current government believes in localism. It believes that this is entirely the remit of local authorities, and as such we have a very patchy framework of different levels of provision around the country. What is your view on this? Do you believe the government should have proper good quality standards that, for example, meet Dutch quality, or do you feel that it should just be left to local authorities?
Thanks, Martin, and yeah, it's a really great pleasure to be here this evening at this well-attended husting. Well, I think there's a fine balance to be had, really, in relation to the question you just asked. On the one hand, Greens believe in decentralisation. On the other hand, there's no excuse for poor standards, substandard infrastructure, etc. So I guess that my answer would be that I think what we probably need is pretty strong national standards. But what you want to do is you want to try to design those in such a way that you still leave a certain amount of room for manoeuvre for local experimentation to try to improve best practice. You don't want to lay things down in too rigid a fashion from the centre, such that local authorities don't have any room for manoeuvre whatsoever, because then that cuts down, as I say, the potentiality for experimentation, for trying something out a bit differently, for moving ahead of the pack and trying to lead us still further on beyond where those national standards are, to where we ought to be getting to, which may well be somewhere where no one really quite knows where that is yet. It may well be something that people haven't quite thought of yet. So I think that would be my answer. A very definite yes to strong, positive national standards, but designed in such a way that you leave some room for local manoeuvre and further improvement.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Fernando. I've been a barrister for 12 years. So when it comes to the issue of national standards and guidelines for better practice, actually I think in terms of cycling, if we start with guidelines for best practice, that gives different cities and rural communities the opportunity to put in place measures working towards a standard that the state recognises as a good standard. The danger if you set national standards now too early. In some rural communities, there may be, we're a little bit fortunate in Cambridge that we have got good cycle paths in some areas. There's a lot more that needs to be done. But if you start setting a national standard, there are communities that would not be able to ever achieve that. So then are we going to say to those communities, sorry, no, you can't have cyclists on these roads because they don't meet the national standard. So I think in order to encourage cycling, and that you see this in many areas of substantive policy, when a new idea is being brought in, let's start with guidelines for best practice, and then if we can, slowly move towards a comprehensive national standard. That would be ideal, but we have to look practically at the different communities and different types of cycling proficiency in those communities as well, and the different types of roads. So I would be against the national standards at this stage, but I think it's something we can work towards.
Well, firstly, it's great to see so many of you here to talk about this issue. It's great in some ways to be with an audience where I don't have to start off by explaining why cycling's a good thing. If there's anyone who still needs to be persuaded, we can chat afterwards. And we'll have to do a whole piece of it. Something I've worked on quite hard in my 5 years as Cambridge's MP, serving as the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary cycling group. And we've got some things out of that which I think we'll talk about later. To come directly to the question, the answer is you can have both national minimum standards and localism. And I don't see a contrast between the two of them. What you do is you say nationally, these are the standards we have to have. They should be better than what we have now. They should be really good. I would suggest, for example, some things in making space for cycling might be a good way to start. You know I agree with that, because I'm inside saying it. That would be a really good way to have it. So you set out those national standards. We get rid of some of the really ridiculous, the short shared use facilities, the right-hand sudden turns, all the sort of ridiculous, silly ideas. But you also allow local areas to set higher standards than that, to do even more. I'm sure Cambridge would want to do much, much more. What I wouldn't want to see is something where the national standards constrain what you can do locally in a negative way. I mean, Martin, you know, and I'm sure there are other people who know that until a few years ago, if you wanted to put up a road sign which had a no entry sign and then underneath it said accept cycles, you had to get the Secretary of State to sign it off. That is a central standard too far, and we have to relax that. So yes to good national minimum standards, a big improvement of those, and yes to localism to do even better.
Good evening, I'm Daniel Zeishan. Very good to see a lot of familiar faces already from some of the Hustings trail. I see some of you are following around. Actually, you won't probably be surprised to hear. I mean, Labour's often been criticised as a party that's perhaps a bit top-down, sets targets and all the rest of it. And I think, yes, if we're actually going to change things, we're probably going to have to do it, because if you're going to rely on Conservative county councils across Shire counties to do this stuff, apologies to county councillors present, I think you're going to need a bit of help from national government to make it happen. So Labour wants to put a stop to the kind of stop-start investment we've seen on cycling, where every now and then you get some money announced. I know this is something which you and I talked about when we met a few months ago. Some consistency, and if you really get serious about making a shift, a modal shift, which I think we've got to do, then you are going to have to say to cities and rural areas right across the country, no, this is what we're going to go for. Because if you just leave it to individual councils, we know what happens. And if you leave it to individual councils in a time of very tough finances, then it ain't going to happen, it's the truth. So we think a proper national cycling strategy, we think proper funding, and we're looking at doing some cross-departmental stuff, so it's not just left in one pot, there's actually some serious money to go with it. And yes, some national standards too, on tackling the really quite worrying safety record we're now seeing in some places, partly because of HGVs. But actually, there were targets set before by the last Labour government. We want to go back to that, because that's the way in which you actually lift things up. So, answer to your question, I think as we're going across, I'm certainly most enthusiastic about having national standards. I accept there are times when you have to have a negotiation with local people about how you implement them. But no, we want national standards, we want to actually make the change.
Yeah, thank you. I think following on from that, there was a question, and I think Dan slightly touched on it there. In the Netherlands, they spend the equivalent of over £20 per head per year on cycling. Would we like to see that as a target for the UK to meet, or something that should be exceeded as a specific target in order to bring our infrastructure up to scratch?
Okay, well, this question really takes us to the nub of the issue. But my answer as a Green is yes, let's invest more heavily in cycling. Now, my guess is that most of the colleagues here are going to say something similar as well. But the question you need to ask yourselves this evening, it seems to me, is who's really serious about this? So Julian, for example, has this splendid record of being a pro-cycling MP. He's involved in the all-party parliamentary cycling group, etc. And you may well, many of you in this room may well be thinking, for example, well, if I want someone who's going to be good for cycling, then I can't really go far wrong by re-electing Mr. Hufford. But what I would put to you is this, that if you want to have someone who is an MP who is not just pro-cycling in the context of being pro-everything else as well, but someone who really believes in cycling and in walking and in public transport, and is willing to make the hard decisions to show that, well then you need to be voting Green. Because I can tell you something for nothing. At all the other hustings, we may not hear it tonight, but at all the other hustings, my colleagues here go on enthusiastically about how they want to build more and more roads, how they want to have massive expansion of the A14 and so on and so forth. That's what they talk about to the business people and to most of the other hustings we've been to. Right? What we have in the Green Party is a vision of radically changed priorities in this country for transport. Putting public transport and cycling and walking first, and saying no to the road hauliers, and saying no to those who want to have a massive expansion of our road network, and saying no to the so-called motorist lobby. So if you want to have someone who says, well yes, I like cycling and I like everything else, I like some rail and I like some road and so on and so forth, then by all means vote for any of these guys. But if you want to have someone who actually means it, when they say put cycling first and not actually have far, far more investment in roads that makes the cycling investment look pitiful by comparison, then I would urge you to support the Green Party. And I'm going to be hoping to expand on this as we go on here this evening. We actually have a vision, both nationally and locally here in Cambridge, for how we can make cycling and walking and public transport number one, and how we can reduce the amount of car travel and reduce the amount of travel by lorry. And the number one priority for us right here in Cambridge, the way to do that is a congestion charge.
Thank you. Of course, the answer is yes. We would like to see more funding going into cycling, and that is something that we have pledged to deliver on. Whether you have someone who means it or you have someone who can deliver on it are also two different things. And what you will get from me is someone who will have the ear of government and who will have a strong voice in Parliament. So just to give you a few figures, over this Parliament we've actually quadrupled the investment in cycling. It's gone up to 438 million. And we continue to champion cycling because we see the benefits in terms of health, less pollution and less congestion. So we have, at the moment, it's a Conservative cycling minister, Robert Goodwill. He came to this city about a month ago to announce Cycle Point, the new parking facilities for cycles at the railway station. We have invested in the city deal. I think the city deal could have gone further. I think we need more money, actually, for a more joined-up solution on transport and cycling in Cambridge. So there is more to be done. Sometimes it's not just about a per-head figure. So you quoted £20 per head. Actually, it's about looking at cities where cycling is a great and very utilised source of transport and investing more money specifically into those cities, as well as looking at access from rural communities into Cambridge. So really the way to look at funding for Cambridge, and we have to make that case to government, and that's what you will get from a Conservative MP in Cambridge. Someone who can convince and make the case to government that what we need is more money for cycling and why we need that money. So, for example, our satellite cities, there should be better routes coming in to Cambridge so that people don't have to rely on their cars. And also, it's about looking at cycling not in isolation, but as part of the wider transport policy. So, for example, our public transport system is somewhat appalling in Cambridge. We need to tighten that up. We should really be leading the world in terms of our transport system because we are a city that is capable of doing that, but we are plagued and beleaguered with traffic problems that we are unable to do that. So I want to get the brightest minds in this city together, work with our local authority partners, but particularly have someone, elect someone who will have the ear of government.
Thanks. I like the start of what Rupert was saying. And I did spend 5 years leading the all-party cycling group. We had 2 of the largest debates we've ever had. We've made a huge change. And it's great to have been endorsed by people like Chris Boardman. So I'm not sure you can have an MP who will do more about it. Some of that led, and I think the point about being broader than cycling is right. And that's why some of that led to me securing a cycling and walking investment strategy for the first time. There is a road investment strategy. I argue that there should be one for cycling and walking, and I managed to get that through. That is now the law, and that is changing the way DFT works. It has changed the status of cycling and walking in the department from peripheral things that sort of don't matter to core activity. If you talk to Sustrans campaigners, talk to anybody, it has changed what is happening. I'm very proud of achieving that. In terms of the actual question about funding, because it is a really, really key issue, in the Get Britain Cycling report that I led the inquiry onto, we said specifically there has to be a cycling budget of getting to £10 per person per year, increasing to 20. That has to be the right thing to do. We have to do it. As a party, we have endorsed that. It's in our manifesto. That hasn't been published yet, but you know, it is. I'm responsible for writing some bits of it, so you know, I can be pretty sure on that. And I'm really proud that we are the only one of the 3 main parties, at least, to have actually said that we will do it. It was described in the Telegraph as one of the daftest 5 Lib Dem ideas ever. The idea of putting £10 per head into cycling. You know, that tells you a lot about that. The Tories have been quite clear. We had a cycling hustings in London. The Conservatives have been quite clear they will not commit to £10 per person per year. They've been explicit about that.
That's incorrect.
Well, no, it is actually, because that's what they said.
You're not asking the Conservative Party.
As have Labour, who have been absolutely expressly clear that they will not put £10 per person per year. Daniel was very, very on message, as ever, and he said Labour wants to put a stop to the stop-start funding. That's what all Labour transport spokespeople say every single time. My worry is if you put a stop to that in the stop position, you do a lot less well if you keep it in the start position. And so you have to have that commitment. The thing that really upset me about this, because we are making progress, and there are people in Labour who are pro-cycling. Mary Cray, until she was pushed out, was very good. There are people in the Conservatives. Sarah Wollaston, for example, is very good. But we have these facts. There was just one awful example, which we saw at the beginning of January. There was this slightly dodgy dossier that the Tories put out about Labour's spending commitments. They said Labour will spend £63 million on cycling. And the response from Ed Balls was, that's not true. It is just nonsense to suggest that Labour would spend £63 million on cycling. The response should have been, £63 million is not enough. Unfortunately, that's not what we heard. We are absolutely committed to this, something I've pushed for many, many years.
I personally will absolutely push to reach that kind of target because I think it's really, really important. Now, in terms of the party, the difference between the Labour Party and some of the other parties is that we've actually got a chance of being in government in 5 weeks' time, and we've actually got to find the money to do it. And that is the key problem, I have to say, with the Conservative account so far this evening, because if you look at the projections forward, I have to say the outlook for local authorities and for DFT budgets is truly alarming. Basically, there will not be any extra money at all, as we talked about. The question will be where is it coming from? Now, Labour has to be much more cautious because any remote whiff of a spending pledge, of course, is seized upon by the national media and said, there you go, you know, you're going to waste all the money again, all the rest of it, all that kind of nonsense. But the key difference with Labour is that we are not promising huge tax giveaways in the next Parliament. We believe the economy can recover, and if we get that recovery, then the question is, where do you put those resources? Now, for us, it's going to be about putting them into public services. There will then be a debate about how you balance putting it into the National Health Service, which quite clearly needs it, big time, and other services too. And so it'll be down to people like me, I suspect I'm there, making the case, because frankly, as Julian has said, there are some people on all parties who are keen on cycling and positive. That's not universally the case, so you're going to need strong voices. And let me just say, I would have said this in my opening statement, I pay tribute to the work that Julian's done. Julian and others have been very, very strong voices on this cause. So whoever's representing Cambridge must continue that work. But one should be under no illusion. The economic arguments are very, very fraught at the moment. So that's why you're not going to be getting big, big spending commitments from Labour. But what you can do, and this I think is very clearly, particularly what Mary Cray said, was that she wanted to shift some part of the transport budget towards cycling because she could see the benefits. Michael Duggar was here a couple of weeks ago, probably not a distinctively keen cyclist as Mary is, but he came here, I put the arguments to him, and I'll continue putting the arguments to him. Politics is a complicated set of debates that goes on constantly, and it's about trying to make sure that you've got influence with the people who are going to be making those decisions. So in answer to the question at the beginning, that's what I would go for, and I think actually when you look at the cost-benefit analysis of the investment you put into cycling compared to the other transport forms, you get a very good return, and that's why we can win that argument.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on some of the things that Julian said. So I'm our national transport spokesperson. I wrote most of the transport section of the Green Manifesto. I just want to point out that I think it's just so important that we get very clear about this. There's one candidate here this evening who's saying no to the A14 expansion. One candidate who's saying yes to a congestion charge. One who's saying yes to bring back the fuel tax escalator. One who's saying let's get rid of the whole national road building programme. One who is saying massively invest in walking, cycling and public transport, not in roads and not in air. And you know who that one candidate is. So you can have someone who believes in cycling within the context of essentially a business as usual framework. Or you can have someone who actually believes in cycling and walking and public transport because they don't believe that the future lies with roads and air. And you have to, well, I'll be able to do something about it. The good citizens of Cambridge are good enough to elect me. This was the third strongest seat for the Greens in the 2010 election. Caroline Lucas, one person, has done more than 50 odd MPs from your party, Daniel. Imagine what we could do if we had 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 of us in Parliament, and that's what you'll get, someone arguing for those strong radical policies. There's going to be a balanced Parliament. We could be a part of making the decisions in the direction I've just indicated. Think very carefully before signing up for second best.
Just very quickly, unsurprisingly, Julian Huppert is not writing the policy for the Conservative Party manifesto. I do have it on record that we have pledged £10 per head over the next Parliament, but actually I believe we can go further. And on the issue of investing in roads, if there's a pothole and you're cycling along and you accidentally hit the
Road
pothole,
building programme cancelling.
Well, it counts
We
for
maintain the
everything.
road
You have to-
maintenance programme, not the road building programme.
it includes everything, Rupert.
No,
If you hit the pothole, you go flying as a cyclist. So I'm sorry. The idea.
We
that
would
you-
maintain the road maintenance budget, not the road building budget.
Well,
Just clarify that.
Well, the reality is, Rupert, if you had your way, we wouldn't do anything with roads.
So you're writing a green manifesto. That's her family over there.
Is it wrong to applaud?
It's absolutely fine. I'm just pointing out who you are.
Okay, yes, very good. Okay, move on to...
Well, I'm sure we can talk about all of these things forever. But
Okay, got in a somewhat different direction. We've got a question on cycle theft. I'll read it out as written out. Given the propensity of the police to let cycle thieves off with a caution or restorative justice, would you support a specific criminal offence of bicycle taking, which is triable only on indictment? The question asked, and if we start with Daniel this time, just to...
I think I can confidently say that's not Labour Party policy. I think I can fairly confidently say that, I mean, I'm not a great fan of the prison system in general, and I just think that, this is a serious issue, an important issue, but, and a lot of it, a lot of the law is actually about how it's applied, how it's enforced. I went to quite considerable lengths actually in the last Labour government to actually argue the stronger powers of police community support officers to have powers over some of these issues. So I think more should be done. I mean, bicycle theft is still a big issue in this city. Personally, I'd like to see some of the more technological kind of approaches that are now more possible to do things. But also, it has to be said, I know that the cycling community in this room, sensible, responsible. Not everyone always looks after their things perhaps as carefully as they should. So it's not just about enforcement, it's also about the people looking at their bikes, and the rest of it, which in turn is about having proper places to lock your bike to, and so on and so forth. But I wouldn't go that far now.
So I was thinking about the idea of blaming people having their bike stolen, but I'm sure that's not what you meant to do. I wouldn't agree with the idea of a specific criminal offence. I agree, I don't think it would help that much. And prison is actually not that effective at stopping people from doing things. There is lots and lots of evidence that says, for example, actually restorative justice, which was mentioned in the question, is actually better at stopping reoffending. There's been a whole lot of research in various areas. I don't know the evidence that specifically for cycle theft. There's been done in lots of other areas, and what's really interesting about RJ is that It's found that it's better at reducing reoffending, it's preferred by victims, and it's cheaper. Which strikes me as a pretty good triple hit, actually. If you spend less money, get a better outcome, and people prefer it, you've done quite well. So I think the issue isn't about having a new law. I think that wouldn't be the right way to go. It is about making it easier for people to have somewhere to lock up. You know, one of the things we did when we were still running City Council was to start getting more places around town to lock up. You need way more of those. New cycle park at the station will help. You have to have, you know, proper objects for people to actually lock up to, and that will make a big difference. You also need the police and locals to actually take it seriously, not to consider it as a sort of trivial thing. This is a really important form of transport. You know, they would take car theft much more seriously, and not just because of the value, because it can stop people from being able to get around. It can be really, really disruptive. I think there's also a lot more that we could do, and Daniel's right about technology, for example. There's some really nice things about trackers, and even if just a few more bikes had sort of things that you can drop into the frame so that it can be tracked, that would provide a disincentive. Same with labelling. And for me, it's all part of actually a much bigger thing about criminal justice policy, something else I'm involved with working on, which is about designing out theft. It was what happened which did change car thefts. There used to be way, way more car thefts because it was easy to do. Now it's hard to do. Car theft has gone down because it's just simply not worth it. Some of the security changes in phones have started to have an effect on theft of mobile phones. It's still a long way to go. We can do the same thing to just make it that much less tempting to go and steal a bike.
I love the fact that that question has a lot of legalese in there, trial on indictment as opposed to trial summarily. I suppose it was a lawyer that may have put that question through. No, you don't need a new offence. The Theft Act is there, dishonest appropriation of another person's belongings, and we can use the existing legislation to prosecute people. I think one of the reasons the police sometimes look at other methods of dealing with it, it is seen as a lower grade offence by prosecuting authorities, and that's a policy decision that the prosecution service needs to look at. I could get into the depths of the legal analysis of this. I should tell you that you probably don't want to hear all of that, but I should tell you that I did speak to the Chief Constable at Huntingdon about cycling crimes, and one of the points he raised was in terms of people who've consumed alcohol and then ride their bicycles. And I said, well, you know, are you going to try and police that in any way? And he said, I'd rather people were drunk and fell off their bicycle than they got in their car. So there's a balance that's being constantly struck by the police force. And it is very, you know, whether your handbag is stolen, whether your bicycle is stolen, whether it's something like your mobile phone, or even your pen when you're at school and another child steals it, it's your personal belonging, and you feel like a victim of a crime at that stage. What we should be doing is improving some of our lighting and our vigilance in areas so as to reduce the crime of bicycle theft. It is prevalent in this city, but that's also because we have a high number of cycles as well. So the two go hand in hand, and I think local policing is something that we need to work with local police officers to elevate the scale of bicycle theft to something that is prosecuted, to just set a few examples and deter people. It's certainly not something that needs to be done on indictment.
Yes, I don't have a great deal to add to what colleagues have already said, so I'll just say three things very briefly. Firstly, I didn't really like, as has already been suggested, I didn't really like the part of the question which sort of tried to do down restorative justice. Restorative justice is actually often the best way to seek justice, and I would suspect it probably is in cases like this. Secondly, enforcement is of course terribly important, and one thing I think does need a bit of change is that it seems to me that there are still some police officers and police forces which don't take cycle crime as seriously as they take motor vehicle crime. And that, from a green point of view, is completely unacceptable. And any crime against cyclists, whether it be stealing their bike or driving in a manner that endangers them, ought to be taken absolutely 100% seriously. And I think probably there's a role for, if you will, education there, in terms of trying to bring police officers to the correct point of view on that. And finally, really, really important to ensure that there are the right places to lock bikes up. And one of the things that means is that we have to provide more cycle parking on street in Cambridge. And one of the things that means is we have to take away some parking road space from cars. there's a trade-off there. If we're going to have adequate cycling parking in large parts of central Cambridge, we're going to need for a few car drivers to sacrifice their parking places, and that's going to be a very good trade.
Follow up on that.
Oh, I was actually just going to say, sorry, I meant to say earlier, there was a brilliant thing that police did a few years ago where they opened up an undercover second-hand bike shop and ran it for a while and did a whole range of things. And after a bit, people started bringing stolen bikes to them to fence. And they kept processing this for a while, and then had a very good picture of who it was who kept showing up with a whole collection of bikes. And it was very, very effective. So the police do sometimes take it seriously, and that one was quite a fun operation, quite exciting when it was like
the bicycle stuff was caught as a side effect in an attempt to cut down house crime.
Well, there was a range of reasons why they set up the shop, but it was very effective.
Sorry, the gentleman does raise a very interesting point. I have seen cases where it is attached to a verbal charge that there was a cycle theft incident. So, yeah, I do think it boils down to local policing.
Got a supplementary question on somewhat related to this from James here.
My question links in with what you've been saying, and this is the problem of getting access to CCTV footage. Will you actively support additional measures, including, if necessary, legislation, to compel those with control over CCTV footage to make the footage available and publishable by those on bicycles involved in collisions and those whose bikes are stolen? Now, at the moment, it's very difficult indeed for anybody to get, for any ordinary member of the public to get access to CCTV footage. All buses now have CCTV, and we should be able to get access to that. The city council make it very difficult to get access to their CCTV. So do the county council. The Grand Arcade refuses, or has refused so far, when bikes are stolen from the Grand Arcade cycle park, to make their footage available, so that people can see who it is who has stolen their bike. And of course there's the problem of the police. But it's the making this CCTV footage available and publishable. The Sixth Form College in Hills Road recently, we've seen for the first time in the local paper, or first time that I'm aware of, a splendid photograph taken by the CCTV at the Sixth Form College showing two offenders going off with a stolen bike, or two potential offenders, two apparent offenders. Now, we want much more of that. Published material so that more people get caught.
Well said.
Corey, would you like to deal with something?
Charlie.
Sorry, could I interrupt? Yes. Could we have the candidates standing to answer the questions again, please? It's quite hard to hear.
Okay, yeah.
There we are. Who thought it? You'd come to a Hustings and you'd get some free legal advice. So, if your bicycle is stolen, I still have my practicing certificate, so it's technically okay for me to tell you this. But if your bicycle is stolen, or if some kind of crime occurs and you believe that there's CCTV footage that could try and identify the suspect, there's two things you need to do. One, notify the police in writing that there is CCTV footage, this is the time the incident occurred, and to retain that CCTV footage, and two, notify the local authority of exactly the same. So it's the retention, and if that CCTV footage is destroyed after your letter has been brought to their attention, then there are consequences in respect of that. In terms of actually making the CCTV footage available, once you've put that letter in place with your local authority and with your police force, then you set the wheels in motion to be able to identify potential suspects and work with the police. I had my handbag stolen actually in London, and I went to great lengths to make sure the CCTV was retained by the establishment where I believe my handbag had been stolen, and to notify the local police authority. Admittedly, it was a handbag, it was probably not as expensive as a bike, including contents, and even with my legal knowledge, I struggled to get the result that I wanted. And that is unfortunate, it does happen. The CCTV is kept by a local authority for a certain number of days, usually 28 days to anywhere up to 3 months. So it's about notifying them of the incident and that the CCTV should be retained because it is important to a police investigation. So there's 2 pieces of free legal advice as to who to write to, and I would urge you all, if you are in that situation, to exercise that.
Yeah, just as a background, I had this conversation with the head of Cambridge CCTV, and he point blank refused to provide the footage even after I quoted the Data Protection Act, which allows me to get the footage for the purposes of investigating the crime. They don't do their job. Until that's changed, it's not going to work. Sorry.
Just as the police don't do their job, not cautioning these people locked up.
Yeah, I mean these issues actually
They
go
just
back,
don't do their job. Sorry,
it goes back to policing and how much, the police have the laws in place. They have a law in terms of retention of CCTV and making that available for a police investigation.
Does that apply to buses? Would the legislation apply to the bus?
Well, individual bus companies will also have within their own policy documents reasons why they are retaining CCTV. So again, if you feel that, this bus should be able to provide CCTV footage that is relevant to me, you write that letter to say, look, such and such a bus was on this road at the time that this happened, and I want the CCTV to be retained, because ultimately, if it is not retained, you can't, what are you going to publish?
But can they be compelled to, if there is bus footage, I'm not aware, maybe it has happened, but I'm not aware of any case where Stagecoach has made available footage, even when there's been a bus present, when there has been a bike has been involved in a collision. Maybe somebody can correct me on this, but I don't know of any case.
Well, I couldn't tell you in respect to Stagecoach, but I can tell you that it happens in London, where bikes are involved in collisions, the CCTV is retained from local authorities and from buses.
So the essential question is, should there be additional powers to compel and make sure that especially commercial operators retain their data for longer? Yeah. Joe?
I think if you pick who was
and
I think it's really interesting. There was at least one counter-example of Stagecoach. It was me and my bike. So a number of years ago, but I was a counter at the time, and it's very hard to ask questions when they know who you are. So I think yes, they should make it available for the police or for your own purposes according to the law. The Data Protection Act is quite clear. I'm slightly worried about the idea of all of it being necessarily publishable, because it does feel a little vigilante and a little, how much else is captured within the image. So there is certainly a balance to strike there. There's a reason why we don't just stream CCTV everywhere out into the public world all the time. There is a new commission which we put in as part of the Protection of Freedoms Act to look at CCTV usage, to try to make sure that it's being used for the purpose it's supposed to be used for and not misused. There have been a number of rather unpleasant cases of misuse of CCTV. I suspect the Commissioner would have the powers to make sure that people do comply with using it for the purposes for which the CCTV is being collected. So I think there might be a route to challenge through that. I haven't considered this particular thing before, so and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to claim years of legal knowledge. But I think there must be a way that you could compel them to share it for the purpose of the investigation. I think that should help. It does require the police to do their job as well. And if the City Council is not complying with the law, then that's clearly problematic, obviously. I would say send me the details. If I'm re-elected, send me the details, I'll have to take them.
Yeah, so first quick point, don't assume that CCTV is going to solve all your problems. I had my bike stolen some years ago, and the place where the CCTV was, where the bike was stolen, gave the footage to the police, and the person who did it was captured on the footage, and you couldn't really tell who they were. It was just simple as that. So, this is just going to be one component of a much broader picture. But, having said that, I think that in terms of that picture, it comes back to what I said before about enforcement. Right? We need to have a culture among the police and among local authorities that takes these things seriously. And the police, if there's been a serious crime, a significant crime committed, the police obviously have the power to get that footage, and they should use that power. And if I'm your MP, and it's not happening, I'll knock heads together to try to ensure they do. Simple as that. The police should take all crime involving bikes seriously, and so should local authorities. So let's make sure it happens.
I'd agree with a lot of what's been said already, but there's 2 areas I would pull out. I think it raises the whole question about private companies providing public services, whether it's public space, like the Grand Arcade, or whether it's private companies providing a public service like a bus service. Because clearly it's different from a public authority. And I think we're entering a whole new world now where the technology is now possible to do all kinds of things. And I think most of our legal framework and our politics is struggling to keep up with that, quite frankly. And I'd be very worried about some of these issues in terms of privacy if we were saying that everything that's filmed is available to everybody under any circumstances. Now, obviously, I suspect you're asking for the right to get access when a specific offence has taken place. And it would seem to me the way to do that is through the police. But I have to say, talking to the police, the impression I get from them is they are really struggling to catch up with the kind of world we're now living in, where, exactly as Julian has said, a few years ago, car crime was kind of top of their list. Now, it's almost completely gone because of the technology. A lot of the kind of thefts that they used to deal with, again, because of technological change, the kind of things that people used to nick and flog down the pub aren't worth anything anymore. It's completely changed. But they haven't, a lot of these people have not been trained to keep up with the modern world. So we've got some really big challenges here. But I'm cautious about saying that everything that's filmed is available to everybody. I mean, Richard and Anthony will know that there have been some interesting debates with public authorities about who gives permission, when, for what purpose. This is a huge area, and worthy of probably a whole evening debate.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, moving on to a different area. I've got one kind of two-part question that I'll try and I'll ask both parts and see how I answer them. The first part of that is, how would you get one council for Greater Cambridge, if indeed you would you'd be in favour of that?
Sorry.
How would you get one council for Greater Cambridge, if you happen to be in favour of that? And what changes would you like to see to the planning process? It's a rather overarching
30 seconds, yes.
I think the guidance to the planning process, we see a lot of applications coming through that have highways changes involved in them, and the scrutiny that such changes get is much less than if it was a separate highways project. I think that's the context there. So yes. So yeah, how or would you like to see a Greater Cambridge Authority and to help streamline the planning process? Rupert?
Yep. So to start with the second question first, I'll keep it brief because we could talk for hours on that. The number one priority is to get rid of the absolute wrecking of the planning process that's happened in the last 5 years, with the absurd idea that all development is sustainable and a kind of free-for-all of development, therefore being allowed to go ahead under this then Conservative government. So put that into reverse. It wasn't that broke before, so it didn't need this kind of unfixing, if you see what I mean. On the question about the devolution to the Greater Cambridge, in the Greens we're totally in favour of this, and we think there's a huge opportunity for it now in the post-Scottish referendum situation, so it's very exciting. We already have quite a good idea about roughly what area such an authority should encompass. We, by the way, do not envisage this as simply a unitary authority on the contemporary model. We think this should be thought of in terms of a national devolution of power, right? In other words, you need to have far more powers devolved to the local level, a broader local level with real money to spend. As is the case in virtually everywhere else in Europe, we are about the most centralised country in Europe, and that needs to change. People talked a lot during the Scottish referendum about the West Lothian question, but the real thing that we have, the real problem that we have, is a Westminster problem, not a West Lothian problem. We've got far too much power centralised at Westminster. We need to decentralise that. If we did, then we could start to put into place the kinds of measures we need to put in place, for example, on transport. So this is our document, a transport greenprint for Cambridge, setting out the way we want to see transport policy changed in the Greater Cambridge area. You can read it for free on the Green Party website for Cambridge. And the kinds of things that we're talking about in there, we'd like to see an enhanced local authority with much more money, with much greater powers. basically most of the southern half of Cambridgeshire, be able to bring in things like re-regulation of the buses, a congestion charge for Cambridge, a kind of strategic planning for the Greater Cambridge area, and this is absolutely crucial, as much as possible to preserve the green belt as part of that, and not to have the kind of very piecemeal approach that we have at the present time with balkanised local authorities with very little power and very little money. So it's a very strong yes to the first part of that question. We need to have not just a decentralisation, but a devolution of power to a new Greater Cambridge authority.
So in terms of the first question, how would you get one unitary authority for Cambridge? I think the three of us certainly are agreed that that is what is needed for Cambridge. How would you get there? One, it's by stopping the tribal politics between the City Council and the South Cambridgeshire Council. And I think we need to work together, more cooperation, so that people in Cambridge City get to vote on their councillors who are responsible on all areas of policy that are dealt with locally. And that's what I would like to see. So put an end to the tribal politics and help the two councils work together in the greater good of Cambridge. In terms of the planning process, it bemuses me sometimes how planning officers actually take so long, and forgive me if there are planning officers in this room, but sometimes it takes so long to take a decision on a planning application. And I think, you know, I've drafted planning applications, I've been in planning review, judicial review committees as well. And I think that the key thing is this: yes, you need proper consultation, you need wider engagement of the community in that consultation. I know that in respect of Huntingdon Road and the cycle path that's going to be laid on Huntingdon Road, there was this issue which Cambridge Cycling Campaign raised about having proper segregation of the cycle path and the road. And unfortunately, whilst you've got a demarcated cycle path, you're not going to have a raised level. So there is still the danger of collisions. And I think that's something where there was a consultation process, and unfortunately it hasn't yielded the result we wanted. Yes, it's going to deliver a cycle path, but we can do more. And rather than putting money into bureaucratic structures, what we should be doing is investing that money in things like cycle paths.
Well, I'm going to pick up the planning point first, and it is a massively wide one, so thank you for trimming it down a bit. I mean, I've proposed various amendments to bits of it. Two things on the wider aspects of planning. One sort of big national thing, I have a real problem with the way the planning inspectorate overturns things without local information. And actually that can be sometimes the worst cases where bad decisions are made, and particularly where they ignore any guidance at all. Some of you may know some of the change that happened on Fen Road, where there was a process that didn't involve any local consideration of the speed bumps there, which have, you know, actually allow much more speed than what was previously there. So that's a huge problem. I would change that to give more power locally. I think the other thing is I actually thought things were done better when there were local planning decisions in the area committees, because it meant you had councillors who knew the areas much better taking decisions, and more decisions could be made by councillors in public for the chance of people to speak. Whereas centralised law, which is what's happened about a year ago, has meant that fewer are taken by a committee, more are just done by officers, which makes it much harder. In terms of the involvement, you're absolutely right that the planning process makes highways changes without thinking about them carefully. I used to chair the Cambridge Traffic Management Area Joint Committee for a number of years, which is a great challenge. I know some of you from discussions of that on lots of details. And we would spend so much more time trying to get the highways aspects right than some of the planning applications would do, and I think that is wrong. The county has not always been good at providing helpful and sensible advice. It tends to sort of just pass things over as being, yeah, that's basically fine. To pick up on the council, yes, absolutely, we should have a unitary for Greater Cambridge, probably City and South Cambs. That would be roughly the right boundary. We can talk about exactly where it sits. There's a few bits that could be talked about. Actually, we are seeing a much better situation. A couple of things Jamali said I didn't quite agree with, but one of them is that actually we are seeing the City and South Cambs working much, much better over the last 5 years or so than they did before. And that relationship used to be atrociously bad. And I wouldn't say it's perfect, but we are seeing much, much more. And the fact that we were able to secure the City deal on that Greater Cambridge side with the City, with South Cambs, with the county working together has really helped. And that joint
board and the assembly, I mean, they're not perfect, but it's a huge step forwards. The legislation is, I think, underway to provide what's called a combined authority for those three, and I think that is a step towards unitary authority. I think that will have to happen because it will make things much more simple, much more sensible. We also do need to devolve. Rupert was absolutely right to say we're one of the most centralised countries in Europe. I haven't checked now, but 5 years ago we were the most centralised country in Europe other than Malta. And Malta has some good reasons for not decentralising so much. That was really, really painful. I used to serve on the East Midlands Regional Assembly, and one of the tasks we were given was to prioritise transport, regional transport schemes. And I fought really hard to get the Chesterton Station as the top regional transport priority. And we eventually agreed it, that was the top one, and then we discovered the amount of money we had to spend on transport schemes was zero. But this was the top one for the £0 we had to spend. So we have to get much, much more power down to these areas. And that covers the whole of it. I would love to see Transport for London style control over buses. I think that would enable us to say to an operator, you can run this incredibly profitable route, but we also need you to run this service or run this at night or on Sundays or whatever it is, so that people can actually get around, rather than it's just run for money. And that is a huge one. It used to be that the county spent a huge amount of money paying for services, while Stagecoach took the profit from all the more financially successful ones. That has to change. There are way, way, way more powers I'd like to see. I've written quite a lot to that. We've got very close actually to getting an agreement to see more devolution to Greater Cambridge. It ended up being a sort of a quick mention in the budget. But at least there's a hook to hang things on. The big problem is the argument about the boundaries. And so I shouldn't reveal all of this, but quite a lot of us in the business community wanted it to be Greater Cambridge, city, South Cam size. The county council wants everything to be devolved to a county size, and the LEP wants everything to be devolved to an LEP size thing, which is even bigger. So I think Greater Cambridge is the right size, and I really think we have to have lots more powers there. That will make all our lives much more easy, except perhaps for the councils who have to work out how to work under the new arrangements.
Yes, I'd just like to say, what do you think would happen then in all the rest of Cambridge? Cambridgeshire? You know, the poor little bits up in the north that nobody loves.
As
somebody who was working for the county council.
So we can do the whole game exactly how you draw it. I think you would probably want to make Peterborough grow a bit, because a lot of those areas are actually very, very close to Peterborough and look very much to Peterborough. If you look at places like March or Wisbech, they are much closer to Peterborough in many ways than they are to Cambridge. That might change if you get the March-Wisbech railway line reopened. You know, there have been various schemes designed, one where Peterborough takes on Fenland, Huntingdonshire, expands, others where you split the whole thing into. There's a range of ways of doing this. Do you play with Royston, do you play with Newmarket? It gets a bit tedious and detailed, but I think we have to try and get there rather than spending all of our time just simply saying, we know there would be a better thing, we know it would be more efficient, but we can't quite work out what to do.
Yeah. On the planning system, I mean, there are a huge number of things one could say, but in terms of the highways proposals, I worry at the moment about the capacity of the county council to actually do the work in a lot of cases. And certainly even a few years ago when I was a councillor, one could see that quite often they really didn't have the capacity to do it independently. I know, different council, yeah, but the same principles apply. So I think don't underestimate the strain that the system is under at the moment. In broader terms, the unitary authority debate, I've been involved in this in one form or another for 20 or 30 years now, and it's the kind of thing where you just kind of despair because so many people want it to happen, but it seems it's so difficult to actually get any government to actually do what's necessary to make it happen. Certainly for the public, I think all councillors will agree that even after decades of two-tier authorities, the vast majority of the public have no idea who does what. And sadly, not everyone involved always has too much. So there's clearly a very strong case for change. I think the politics of it have already been alluded to, but it's very hard to achieve. And my party's position, and I've pleaded with Hilary Benn and others in the job to just go ahead and do it. In fact, Labour did try and do it for a number of local authorities towards the end of the last government. The end result was the Conservatives actually put it in their manifestos they reversed it. It was that specific. So it was then undone again. And what one doesn't want to do is waste huge amounts of public money going through local government reorganisation that some will remember from 10 and 20 years ago. So Labour's position on this at the moment is very much the combined authority route, which does rely on good relationships between councils. Now I'd agree with Julian that in the last few years, certainly in South Cambridgeshire, I remember when I first got involved around here 10 years ago, I took a group down to see Ben Cooper, who was then the housing minister, and South Cambridgeshire, without perhaps being unfair at the time, was considered to be a basket case. And very much thinking of the Labour government for that time was it was on the cusp of putting in a housing development corporation or something to actually try and make some stuff happen. At the time, we kind of said, well, give it a little bit more time because it may improve. And it has improved, and I think a lot of improvements come from the South Cambridgeshire side. And I think the relationship now is much stronger than it's been for a long time. But I still think it will be difficult to get the kind of cooperation between the districts and the county council, which will give us the kind of clarity that's required. Because what I hear, particularly from businesses, is that it takes so long to get any decisions on anything here that actually we are at risk in future of people just going somewhere else. And that may sound like an odd thing to say when we've got AstraZeneca coming and all the rest of it, and it seems like we've got the problem of success. But you cannot guarantee that the success continues. You've got to have the structures in place to make sure that it works. So I'll be pushing very hard, actually, for us to come to something very, very close to a unitary authority, even if it isn't what, the perfect structure that one would like to see. And final plea, really, I just hope that after this election, whoever's elected representing this city, and there will probably almost certainly, will certainly be new MPs in the area around, that people can take this opportunity to perhaps park some of the stuff that's happened in the past and actually try and work together. Because there's a real opportunity at the moment. In a city deal, I support, I mean, I'm on record as saying that in my view it's a watered down city deal. I think it was very close to being something very indeed. And I think, as ever, the Treasury got its nits on it and did water it down. But Cambridge has got such potential, and the finances just make it absolutely clear. We've got a huge amount we could borrow against in terms of our housing stock and in terms of our infrastructure. The case is absolutely clear that we ought to be able to do these things, but at the moment we're still constrained. So the huge opportunity coming along, and Labour's pledge at the moment is to devolve a huge amount of spending from Whitehall, £30 billion worth, covering a whole range of things, training, social security, transport. This is something quite different from anything we saw under the last Labour government, and it's a huge opportunity. So, massive question, long answer I'm afraid, but huge opportunity, and some of that should include cycling.
So, just on that point about the local plan, this is what I don't understand. I mean, just looking from a business perspective, £1 billion doesn't buy you very much these days. I mean, if you take the Shard in London, that was £1 billion. You know, there's a park in Canary Wharf, which has just got trees in it, which costs 200 million. And as I understand, the city deal is going to be delivered 100 million, 100 million, 100 million over a number of years. Now, obviously, you're IMP, you represent us. Why is it that, say, Boris Johnson goes in and gets, you know, Crossrail, and then there's HS2 to Manchester, and at the same time, here in Cambridge, we, you know, the government says we are the most important economic scientific centre for the UK, etc. And yet, really, you've got a drop in the bucket from the government in terms of these infrastructure projects. And so, your comment that things are working well, my question to you is, are they working well? Because actually, you've had peanuts from the state in terms of infrastructure.
I mean, I think, firstly, I mean, we've had way more than we've ever had before. And I think that is worth being aware of. I mean, London is, of course, bigger than Cambridge. I think that's, you know, really quite important to be aware of. So the £1 billion from the city
Not
deal...
economically.
Well, no, economically, London is bigger than Cambridge. We may wish it were different. In terms of GVA, we're ahead. You know, there are other measures that one can use. But the raw size of the economy of London is bigger.
But the market cap-wise, once you add up the market caps of Cambridge companies, actually, when you take AstraZeneca and you take ARM and you add these together, you get to a very substantial chunk, percentage-wise, much bigger than you're saying. So it's not quite as simple.
I didn't give a figure, but if you add up all of the businesses in London, you do get a bigger figure than that.
Obviously.
But the £1 billion is more than we've ever had before for this sort of thing. It's the first time that we've really been able to get ahead of the game. So previously what happened was a lot of money was raised in Cambridge, business rates, all sorts of other things, which went up nationally. Cambridge didn't get to retain very much of it at all. And then we would bid to try to get pots of money to do all sorts of things. The idea here is to say, look, one of the consequences of that was there were lots of, you've got a bit of money to do this project, you've got 200,000 to get this thing done, so there's a lot of bits of things. So if you look at, for example, Newmarket Road, it is basically the residue of a whole series of little projects which made sense at the time of what you had. The city deal means you can start to do things like redo Newmarket Road and rethink the whole thing. So it's 100 million to start with, then 200 million, then 200 million, match funded locally, which brings you to the billion. Could it be more? Absolutely. But it's massively big. It's bigger than any of the city deals we've had anywhere else. It's a bigger devolution than we've ever had before. So I think that's pretty good. You also talk about things like HS2. You've got things like the Chesterton Station, New Science Park, or Cambridge North, I think it's like that's been something that's been on the list that I've been campaigning for 15 years, since I first became a councillor, and it's finally going ahead with government money behind it. We are seeing a whole range of other things. East-West Rail, another dream for ages. We've got money in there to actually start doing the work to find a route, because of course you can't build it without a route. And I hope that together with Lambrook Station, will be able to get into the next control period for rail construction. So there is a lot more coming here than we have ever had before. And the idea of giving it in larger sums means you can start to actually make the work. Is it everything we wanted? No, it's not. I mean, Daniel's right. The city deal that we were bidding for, that we ran the city council and we were really pushing hard for, went a bit further. And I've been trying to get some of those other bits. The Treasury are not as keen, are not as persuaded, but we have made some more things. For example, I was talking about business rate retention. We've now got, it's a pilot, to allow us to keep 100% of the growth in business rates. That I think will be the start of some more. What's really interesting is the pilot, it's Manchester who are going to do it, and it's us. And actually we are right up there because of the amazing economy that we have, the dozen billion-dollar companies that we have. It is fantastic. We are finally beginning to get some of that, which we never got for decades before.
Well, it's also house building, because last year, London built 18,000 houses, and we're actually building more houses than any other area in the country. And yet, despite that, I'd say £100 million is roughly the budget of the new library in Birmingham that was built. And so, actually, I can't agree with your view, because I think pound for pound, it's very little money we've actually received from the government. That's the sort of private.
It's more than we've ever had before, and it's ahead of the development, which makes a huge difference. But I would love to see much more. I mean, I wrote a letter to the Cabinet Committee that was looking at this with a much larger pitch. I've written about it in the Cambridge News, but if you're interested, I can send you all of that. That would get us even further. But but we've got more than anyone else. And I have to tell you, you look at places like Oxford, you look at other places that have got city deals, and they are incredibly jealous of what we've managed to get here. They are really amazed that we've managed to get so much. But I'd love to go further, of course.
I think everyone wants to go back in. I think.
Yeah, so just 3 quick points following up on this. Firstly, on the amount of money that's coming to different places. Of course, it's true to say that London is bigger than Cambridge, but you also need to look at the per capita figures. And actually, when you look at the per capita figures, London is still getting way more than anybody else per capita, let alone in total. And of course, we're actually doing better than some parts of the country in this regard. If you compare the amount per capita for London, for transport spending, to the southwest of the UK, the southwest gets about 1/50th per capita what people in London get. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. And this is something that we in the Greens would like to change. We want to see not a completely level playing field perhaps, but a more equal situation. We want to see more money devolved to the regions for transport and some kind of equalisation of these things. Secondly, specifically on the house building point, let's take the example of Northstowe. If Northstowe goes ahead on the current plans, the cycling provision and the public transport provision will be pitifully inadequate, absolutely disastrously inadequate. Northstowe is essentially being built as a dormitory town which is going to be dependent almost exclusively on the motor vehicle. It's absolutely outrageous. It would never happen in most countries on the continent. And those plans need to be thoroughly overhauled and changed. And finally, to come to the city deal. There are some good things in the city deal, of course. Some of the stuff towards rail is good. But let's be very clear, the city deal involves in its DNA massive new road building plans. And there is no mechanism in the city deal for reducing traffic and for reducing air pollution. We have proposals that would do that in our transport blueprint. Do look at them if you're interested. If one is serious about reducing air pollution, if one is serious about reducing congestion, the city deal, on balance, is pointing in the wrong direction.
Rupert, I'm sorry, just to speak up. Which part of the city deal do you think is a massive road building programme? There's various things for buses, there's massive things for cycling. The entire core of it is about not having as many cars. That's exactly what it is. Which of the schemes that's listed for it do you think is a massive road building project?
No, what I'm referring to is the overall vision of the local enterprise partnership and of the counties which make up the city deal, the authorities which make up the city deal. There is no mechanism for reducing traffic. What there is a variety of schemes which are being proposed in conjunction with road building schemes, such as the road building that's planned for the new places like Northstowe and the road expansion that's planned vis-a-vis the A14 and other A roads. That's what I'm referring to.
Thank you. I think we do need to make the case for more money for Cambridge. Conservative philosophy is to back a thriving city, and that's what you've seen under this government. We've invested £4.8 billion in a new technology centre, £7 billion has gone into science, which has impacted on this region, and £300 million into human genome decoding. So this government recognises that Cambridge is this fantastic city of the future of great British minds. We've got pioneers in science, technology, innovation and research, and we do have to make the case for more money. I'm working with organisations such as Cambridge Ahead and Cambridge Area Partnership to try and say to government, look, give us a little bit more and we will try and bridge the gap as well, in areas like apprenticeships, for example, which is also part of the city deal. I think it is necessary for people to brush up on the city deal and what it involves. But one of the problems with the city deal is there is a bit of a piecemeal approach. A bus lane here, a cycle path here, and that's not going to be good, particularly for cycling. What we want is continuous cycle paths, not to cycle along and suddenly have a sign that says cyclist dismount. So I think some of the projects that have been selected, a vast array of projects were put forward to be decided upon for the city deal, and on the 28th of January they finally decided these are the areas we plan to spend the money in. And I think there, whether there's room for negotiation after an election or whether it's a case of getting more money, actually what we want is a proper vision for this city. Where do we see this city in 50 years' time? We absolutely have to reform the traffic problems that we have in this city today, and our planning needs to look at where this city should be in the future. So yes, we have problems on our doorstep and we immediately need to resolve those, but we need a proper vision going forward, and I think the city deal is lacking in that sense. A strong economy. It goes back to the very basics. Why has money been put in under this government? We have managed to reduce the deficit, so what we are spending on what we've borrowed, what we're spending to service our debts, is what has been put back into things like cycling, and that's money that we can invest in things. So again, it is about getting our deficit down so that we can put that money to better use. So you do need a strong economy, which I'm afraid is only going to be delivered under a Conservative government. So working with local actors is the other key thing, which would help improve things like the city deal. The fact that we have managed to get the business community, local actors, academics, etc., all on board with the city deal, it is a step in the right direction, but I think we can do more, and for that we need a strong voice in Parliament.
Point scoring out the way straight away. Your definition of a strong economy is a situation where you're worse off now than you were at last general election.
Not according to the Institute of Studies.
Absolutely, according to the Institute of Studies. A long week ago. But the point I was going to make, Julian was kind of forgot to mention a very big investment made under the last Labour government, which was very controversial last election, which of course was the guided busway. And there were plenty of people in this room who would have had different views on whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing to do. But it's there, it's working. And what's interesting, Rupert, is actually that's why Northstowe it was part of that whole approach. It is an astonishment to me that our planning system and our system for funding development and infrastructure has led to a situation where you've got a guided busway and no houses for it to serve at the moment. But in the end, hopefully, that will be the way in which Northstowe interacts with Cambridge. But the guided busway, I think, is a really interesting point because some of us I was sitting on the launch this morning of the new Trumpington to railway station service. Anthony was there as well. Partly through the Be the Change, Cambridge Ahead kind of looking at these things at the moment. And it does beg the point, doesn't it? We've now got this huge amount of segregated road space, but actually not that many buses using it quite often. Why? And I get complaints from people about the vast overcrowding at peak times, particularly in places like St Ives. And you talk to the bus company and they say, well, actually we can't get any extra profit out putting extra buses on at the moment. It's the same old problem, that actually if it's left to a private operator in the market, you're not getting the public service that you actually need. And final good piece of news, Julian, you're absolutely right that we do need a properly regulated system for buses, like London. The good news is, with a Labour government, we'll get it. So basically, absolutely, but this time, now, absolutely. No, you can laugh, Julian, because the difference between you and me is I can make it happen. So, much of the last Labour government arguing for this, and the reason, the problem was, the Labour gave local authorities the power to do it. But councils like Conservative county councils like Cambridgeshire were never going to do it. They could have done it, but they chose not to. This time, I'm afraid, writing's on the wall for them, we're not going to give you a choice. We're going to make it happen. And that means we are going to be able to have control over the stagecoach, and it'll make a huge difference to people's lives in Cambridge. That's very good news.
So you don't give a damn about cyclists, you're interested in buses, right?
No, we talked about cyclists extensively at the beginning, but one of the best things that can happen with cyclists in Cambridge is fewer cars on the road, and one of the ways you do that is making the bus system work more effectively. So,
but we're interested in bicycles here.
Yes, I know you are, and I'm explaining to you why those two are not in conflict necessarily. And I think a better bus. To me, the argument in Cambridge.
Why does Labour hate cyclists?
Labour does not hate cyclists. And I'm very careful to not choose between the different modes of transport.
The bus drivers drive us, they're aggressive towards us. That is the big problem.
We need a decent.
No, but the buses drive at us, and you answer that question.
That's a separate. Okay, that's a separate issue. What I'm saying to you is, I want a better bus service in Cambridge because I believe that will help cyclists as well as everybody else. Now, we want to go on to how the bus company operates. I and Andy Campbell have a very fierce relationship at the moment. He's very cross with me for pointing out that the bus fares just went up again a couple of weeks ago.
We're not interested in bus fares, we're interested in safety. We don't want people driving at us.
No, and one of the ways in which that will happen is having more people on buses and fewer people in cars. But in terms of getting bus drivers to operate more effectively and safely, certainly, and Labour's view on HGVs, for instance, is that we are going to insist that they have all those safety mechanisms that will stop some of the awful accidents we've been seeing happening, particularly in London, but also we can see it potentially happening here too. So I think we've got a strong policy on this, which will really help you, but it's only going to happen if you have a Labour government.
With bus drivers deliberately trying to hit someone. Have you seen that?
Absolutely. That I'm saying that is a separate issue from how you regulate buses for fares and frequency.
That's the issue.
Getting well.
Just another point that relates to this, I think, which is slightly overlooked at the moment. I think the modal shift that we've seen on the continent, from people from bicycles to cars onto, from cars and buses onto bicycles, has been because of the commitments that whether it's local authorities or politicians have put behind getting people on bicycles by providing very, very high quality infrastructure, which requires huge investment. And I think maybe some of the people can come out and talk about this.
Sure. There's questions over here.
So hasn't the guided busway actually helped more people ride bicycles into Cambridge by not getting on the buses and just using that path next to the bus? Can't we just build more guided busways without the busway? Sorry, I was expecting an answer.
I say to you, if you want to make the case for more guided busways, you're a brave man. But it could certainly be done more cheap.
Yeah, forget the bus bit.
I have to say you do, if you're going to be moving people from those kind of distances on a regular basis, fast and frequently, you're going to need buses as well. Not either or, as well.
Didn't this launch this morning illustrate a problem of political bodies of one sort or another trying to run a bus service? It's a great idea in the peak to run a 5-minute hop from the park and ride to the station, but not to run one back again that nobody wants to use. At that time of day, you should go to Edinburgh.
There's no reason why it shouldn't. But this is what happens when it's not the operators who design these things, it's people coming along with a bright idea who don't know how to run buses. That's a perpetual problem with transport of all sorts in this country, including cycling.
Those running the buses haven't done much better.
Yeah, well, just quickly pick up on a couple of points just been made. Well, we in the Greens are absolutely upfront. A huge investment in cycling, absolutely. Cycling is incredible value for money. Let's take that money out of road and air, put it into cycling and public transport. So, of course, you've got to look at this in a holistic way. So in terms of when we're looking at the new developments that are being planned for around Cambridge, for example, whenever any of those developments happen, cycling should be designed in from the beginning, and we should look at designing in public transport as well, including potentially we should be looking at light rail.
I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff here which we could go down into. I mean, I'm a veteran of the guided bus debates. I don't think we want to go there. The cycle facility has been brilliant. I'm glad it got escalated from a sort of minor side thing to a decent surface. But what I really wanted to pick up was this idea about modal shift, and some really interesting views, at least I find them interesting, about what we should be trying to achieve, because there has been a sense of sort of fighting between cyclists and pedestrians, cyclists and buses, cyclists and cars. And we get often entrenched. I totally understand how we get into that. And actually, one of the things I think we should start doing is to start trying to get people to think about what sort of city do we want to live in? What would a city look like? If you ask somebody to design and draw and sketch the sort of city they'd like to live in, it's amazing how rarely they include cars in their sketch map. And actually, if we start talking not just about cycling, and I say this as a massive pro-cyclist, but about the space that we want. This is what the secret has been in Denmark and in the Netherlands. That they've talked about the spaces, about the human characteristics of it. And that leads you naturally to want to have walking, and naturally to want to have cycling, and naturally to want to have public transport. Those are consequences of thinking about the space. And that is exactly what they argue when they try and talk to us about how they've gone forward. So yes, we have to have the money, but we also have to start thinking about that. And we have to also remember that what is good for cyclists can also be good for buses. And what is good for cyclists can be good for pedestrians. And that's really good. One of the things I was really proud about when we did this Get Britain Cycling report was we got the support of all the cycling organisations. That's, well, slightly harder than you might hope it would be, but it wasn't too hard to do. We got all the health organisations behind us. There's huge savings in health, physical and mental health, if you can increase cycling. There's a Lancet paper which suggests £17 billion savings for the NHS to get up to Dutch levels of cycling. That's quite useful. But we also got support from Living Streets, a pedestrian organisation, because a lot of things that we as cyclists want are good for us as pedestrians, because of course many of us do both. We also got support from the Automobile Association. We also got support, not for every word of this, from James May. We didn't get his erstwhile colleague, I'm afraid. But actually, if we start talking a lot more about how we make this work for everybody, it's why the segregated facilities which are being built on Huntingdon, and they do look on Huntingdon Road, and they do look very good. We took Chris Boardman to see them a couple of weeks ago. It means that you have pedestrians not in conflict with cyclists, cyclists not in conflict with buses and with cars. That has to be the way forward, and that's the lesson from the Dutch and from the Danish.
I just want to make it clear, I mean, over many years, we as a campaign have in general, encouraged the use of public transport because, obviously, if you can get 40 people in a bus, that is 40 cars off the road space, potentially, that's freed up. However, we have long had concerns that sometimes bus lanes have sort of caused cycle facilities to be pushed onto pavement. So, for example, in 2003, we had a big campaign against the forcing of cyclists onto pavements on Hills Road. And there is concern at the moment, particularly about the city deal, that for example, £37 million is being allocated to a bus lane on Hills Road, when in value for money terms, in our view, you could actually get an awful lot more done. You know, £5 million cycleway and all and I just want to say on the buses, I mean, I think it's absolutely scandalous still that 12 years after we and others said, you know, why is Stagecoach not implemented on-street ticketing? You know, which works incredibly well in London. You know, at the moment in Cambridge, you have this medieval system where basically, you know, you're on a bus, 10 people want to get on, you know, everyone has to get their 50 pences out, or £2.30, whatever it is now, you know, for 5 minutes, and then eventually it goes off. In London, you go on, and the bus is doing off. You've got to solve this problem. You've got to put pressure on Stagecoach, and that would free up space on the roads. It would mean that we don't need all these bus lanes, perhaps, quite as much, and it would improve things
of course, for bus passengers who desperately need to have their service improved.
Yes, and there's a good article in the latest magazine about it, as it happens.
Yeah, just very, very quickly on that. One terminological point that I quite like, let's not call them bus lanes all the time, right? They're bus and bike lanes. Yeah, we ought to seek parity in that way. And then in a more substantive, yeah, that's what they ought to be, or that's what they really are.
Just remove the bike, just remove from the signs in the lanes, the bike, from the...
Well,
from the road.
Yeah.
And if you go down Milton Road at rush hour, the buses can't get in the bus lane because of all the bicycles.
Yeah.
So actually, we should just change all the bus lanes to bike lanes.
Yeah. If we get enough people, I was in Hanoi many years ago, cycling there, and there the bicycle really is king of the road, or at least it was when I was there, because there are 50 bikes for every car or bus, so that's where we ought to really be heading. And of course, in terms of on-street ticketing. The MP for Peterborough recently called me a follower of Pol Pot, which I thought was interesting. Yeah. Not entirely accurate. Go down the route of silliness, or we can go down the route of seriousness. So on a serious point, what we ought to be doing, of course, is having a smart card system, right? That's what's been the revolutionary thing in London. So we need a smart card system, and it's on the way. It needs to be rolled out as quickly as possible, and the absurdity of those queues.
Actually, that's what they use in London now. So
There are some lessons that we can learn from London. So one of the big problems they had when they introduced those bendy buses were cyclists actually got caught underneath bendy buses, and there were so many accidents in London. We are a little bit more fortunate in Cambridge, and there are less, even though we have a high proportion of cyclists, there are actually less bus cycle accidents than there are on proportion in respect to London. So the Chisholm Trail, which is something that has been campaigned on for over a decade, I think, in Cambridge, it's something that is only being delivered under the city deal, and that again it boils down to having money to be able to put into measures. I would like to see, for example, from Newnham to Newmarket, there is this the green route into the city, and I would like to see cyclists having cycle paths that are extremely safe, that you could have a 3-year-old toddler cycling along even without a helmet, because they are very safe cycle paths where they are not going to come into collision with anything other than daffodil. So it's possible, it's doable. We've got some great open green spaces in this city, and I think that we need to make them accessible to cyclists, not destroying our green belt, but actually working at one with our environment.
I think I was going to get around to one last question. We do need to be clear of the hall by 10 o'clock, so we'll try and wrap things up. I've still got questions here. So
it's telling it very well.
So sorry, I was going to take one that I've already. So there was a question from Imogen, age 13. Would you support a Boris bike style scheme in Cambridge?
Ken bike, surely.
Pardon?
Ken bike.
Said Boris on the paper.
Yes, absolutely. I think not everyone has a cycle, and I would like people who come into Cambridge on the train to be able to put their money in and collect a bicycle and go off on their route. Maybe the taxis will suffer as a result, but I think that's the way forward. And I like the idea of Boris bikes. We might actually name it after our own Boris here. And I do believe that Andrew Lansley and a couple of the other Cambridgeshire MPs have already moved to this point about having something similar to the Boris bike. So it is a great cycling city here. I think we can do more to actually become the #1 cycling city in Europe.
Yeah, well, in the Transport Green Paper for Cambridge, we set out the objective of becoming the #1 cycling city for Europe, so that's Charlie's support for that. Yeah, as has been already pointed out, they are actually Ken bikes. They were brought in by the outgoing authority. well, Nate Boris, unfortunately, was able to take credit for them. He was helped by the alliteration, Boris and bike thing, somewhat. Yeah, it's a simple question. Simple answer is absolutely. This is a key part of how Cambridge can move forward in terms of becoming even better at cycling than it currently is.
I think it's really, just to pick up, Cambridge is of course the leading cycle city in the UK, and we match some of the other continental standards on average, because there are some better places there. And if you want to see the data, there's a guy called Phil Rogers, I don't know if you know him at all, who's all on his website. So. I'm old enough to remember the green bike scheme in Cambridge, and I was fortunate enough to have seen a green bike. I'm very proud of that. For those who don't know, this was a scheme where bikes were put out, painted green for anybody to use, and they got nicked pretty much immediately. And the City Council learned from this by putting some more out, which then got nicked immediately. It was not one of the best schemes. Now, we can do a lot better now. Technology has moved on. And I really like the idea. I'm one of the MPs who's been working on this. For the last few years. I think the challenge is actually about cost. Because if you look at the cost of running it, it is a really expensive scheme in London. I mean, they sort of covered some of that with the sponsorship and various other ways of adjusting it. But actually, it's a massively expensive thing to do. And the problem with running it on a smaller scale like Cambridge is that a lot of those administrative costs just get really, really big. So I think it would be wonderful to go the whole way to the sort of, whatever type of bike we're going to call it. I think it would be slightly tricky to get all the way. I think there are lots of things that we can do on the way though. So I've been talking quite a bit to Brompton Dock, for example. So Brompton's these sort of fold-up bikes, and they have a box which takes about a car parking space, which would take, I think the large one takes 12 Bromptons in it. And so you join the thing and you pay a bit of money, and I think it's £5 a day, I'm sure somebody will tell me what the updated prices are, and you get a Brompton for the day. And those have been installed at various train stations around the country, and I think we should have them at the train stations, at other major points where people come in, and in particular at the park and rides, so that we would actually encourage people to come to the park and ride, park for free, by the way, if we can get that to happen. It was a great shame that the charge was put on. One of the things was people said people were driving in, parking, and then cycling into Cambridge and cheating the system. It seems to me that that's what we're trying to get them to. But if we had Brompton Docks there, then anybody coming to the park and ride go, actually, the place I'm going to is not best served by us. It's actually best served by hopping on a bike who want to go, that way. So if we could get those to happen, and the best thing about it is that Brompton have set up the management system, that they will run it all, they will look after all of it. They've even said they'd share the profits with the county council. So I think that would be a really nice way to go. Maybe sometime in the future we can go even further. We currently have about a third of trips in this city for worker education done by bike. That's way ahead of anywhere else. The aim from Cycle City Ambition Grants, which I helped to get for Cambridge, is to get to 40%. I think we can go a bit higher. There does come a limit, because at some point you're competing with walking. We're not, and actually, cycling and walking both have huge health benefits. I'm not trying to get people to cycle and not walk. It's not a particular objective. So you can get a bit higher, and this is the sort of thing which I think just makes it much, much, much easier to do.
Right.
Yes, I'd be slightly cautious too on the cost basis. I mean, actually, the London scheme is widely applauded. Actually, as you dig into the details of it, what you find, and I'd say this as a Labour politician for whom social justice is really important, is the demography of the people who use the bikes in London. It's not generally poorer people in London. A lot of money is going into it. So I'd ask myself the question: if you've got money to spend, and it will cost money, is that the best use of it? And certainly in terms of pedestrians in Cambridge, I think when you look at just some of the basic things, like places that people sit down, there's some very simple things that you can do where I'd spend the money first. So I think we'd all like the idea, but it seems intuitively like a very obvious thing to do in a cycling city. But then in some ways, because so many people already cycle, it may well be that perhaps that's not the best way of doing it. And when you look at certainly some of the railway stations around the region have run very small-scale schemes, it has to be said, and the uptake's been low. So you just got to think through quite how it would work for us. But I certainly wouldn't rule it out, and I'd certainly very happily work with others to look at the details. But then we'd have to find someone generous to also put some money in to make it work, and we'll need to work on that.
Okay. I know there's a lot of questions, but we are a bit pushed for time. I did say
man never gets to ask these questions. You went through the entire environment Hastings without asking each question.
If the candidates seem to be okay for one more question, we'll take a question.
About one sentence answers.
It's not about seats yet. Several questions have touched on the question of public servants and their attitude towards cycling, and you, Daniel and Julian, talked about bus drivers and people with DFT, and there was also questions about the police. There are some people who work for the government directly or provide public services who are hostile to cycling and who are not following the law, and there have been questions and sort of comments about how much the law is being enforced, how much they're being made to conform to it. What can be done practically to change the attitudes of some people within the public services who interact with cyclists either as bus drivers or as policemen or have other positions of responsibility? There is a somewhat hostile attitude amongst just some people in our society towards people who are on bikes. And some of them work for our public services, and there are a lot of people who feel, justifiably or not justifiably, that the law is not being enforced against people for whom MPs would have ultimate responsibility in their interactions with cyclists when they're recommended. What would you do to improve attitudes amongst public servants towards cycling?
Intellectual persons.
I hope I get more than one sentence though. Yes. I think it's a really interesting challenge, and part of it is what's known as an outgroup effect, that people see cyclists as other, which is slightly odd, particularly in a city like Cambridge, where Phil will correct me if I get the figures wrong, most people cycle at least once a month. Thank you. But people see them as other, and so people see any cyclist behaving badly and assume, we all know this sort of idea, I've seen a cyclist go through a red light, all cyclists go through red lights. We've seen that. And the truth is there are cyclists who behave atrociously and break the rules. There are drivers who behave atrociously, and go on through any other road user. And none of that is a good thing to do. I think a lot of it is about leadership by example, and about getting the message across that cycling is serious. That's why the cycling and walking investment strategy was important. When this government started, the new Transport Secretary gave an instruction, I think I'm allowed to say this because the senior civil servant has said it publicly, that the cycling bit of DFT should basically be wound up. That cycling was a trivial, peripheral thing that we just don't need to focus on. We have to cut back. Norman Baker fought very strongly against it. We managed to save it, and we've managed to grow it a lot since.
That's the civil servant,
But this was an instruction being given from a Secretary of State to say it's not important. And we've changed it. It's why actually the all-party parliamentary cycling group has been quite important. To get, we've now got well over 100 MPs as members, a bunch of peers as well, to say actually this is something people do. That it's not a weird eccentric thing that one odd MP does. Lots of people do it. More and more ministers, senior people from all backgrounds. Mary Kay is a cyclist, Michael Duggar isn't. And that's starting to make a big difference. We should get across that idea of leadership by example. We've had some fantastic big debates. Hopefully some of that permeates through. But we also have to be clear that people need to stick to the law. It is not okay to ignore it just because they're cyclists. There isn't a clear, simple answer of, you click your fingers and do one thing, and suddenly all the people who have been indoctrinated by, Jeremy Clarkson or whoever, suddenly realise that it's better. But we have to have that constant pressure from above to say it's something we should do, to get more civil servants to be cycling, to provide training for people who are involved in these areas. There's been exchanging places, slightly different issue, getting cyclists to try going into HGVs and HGV drivers to go on bikes, to get a sense of what it's like for different people. Get more of the people involved to understand what it's like. We do have local council officers here who cycle. We do have police who cycle. That's going to work.
We also need to make it a priority.
Agreed.
And
that's what
without
I've been doing for 5
making it
years.
a priority, there's going to be no real leadership.
On that point, I think there's a couple of points that I want to cover very quickly. The cycling transport minister is actually a Conservative. Under this government, we've put 63 million to Cycling England. We've put 94 million into Cycling Cities and National Parks Fund and 35 million for the Cycle Safety Fund. I think more needs to be done. In relation to your question, I actually think There is a simple answer, and which it is lacking in this country. It's the great pillar of our democracy, which is very simply the rule of law. Make me your MP, and I will guarantee that if you have problems like that, where there are police officers not looking into crimes such as bike theft, that I will write to those police forces, and I will tell them, look, this is what's happened to my constituent, and this is the power that you have within the existing legislation to do something about it. So I think you can actually uphold the rule of law, and it is applicable to everyone. Thank you very much.
Well, as has just been said, it's about making it a priority, right? A Green MP would actually be serious about this kind of thing. The first sign of such seriousness would be, it's all very nice to have these millions. I want to see billions. I want to see billions put into cycling from the road building budget, right? That's how you show that you're actually serious about cycling, by putting it front and centre of your transport policies and not as some kind of minor little add-on that gets cost whatever the others have not already gobbled up. And as I said earlier, as your MP, I would make it a priority to ensure, because this is something that MPs can seek to do by knocking heads together, to ensure that anyone who is in a responsible position of public authority in Cambridge took these matters extremely seriously. So that's what it's about, really. It's about making it a priority, showing that you are serious. One final point. I think there is a role, Julian said something about people from bikes going to HGVs and vice versa. I think that's really good. I think there's a role sometimes for getting public servants to understand these things from the cyclist point of view. It would be great if we could get perhaps some police officers, local authority people, etc., who are not used to cycling but who deal with cyclists in their work, to get on a bike for a few hours or for a day or something like that. See it from the cyclist's point of view, get a better experience of what cycling is actually like. And then those of us who do cycle, they would know a bit more the kind of stuff that we and all of you go through.
Changing culture in any kind of situation is a really, really hard task, and I don't think you do it just by passing laws or even enforcing laws. It's actually about people understanding each other better. And that's why I think I said earlier, I'm very careful not to be fast in terms of one mode or another. And I think I agree with Julian up to a point, but actually I have to say that people are capable of behaving differently depending upon which mode of transport they're using. It's not about the individuals.
That's why I said people on bikes.
Precisely. So I mean, there's been a long tradition of this, hasn't there, quite frankly, in Cambridge. This is not a new conflict or a new issue, but what I think it is significant is I think it has changed in the last 10, 20 years. I think partly it's tribute to the campaigning that you've done. I mean, I was going to say, it's a noted statement, that you are probably the most effective campaigning organisation in the city. And when we were having the planning discussion, actually, I'd say you use the planning system much more effectively than most others. So I think you are part of the change that is happening. Cambridge is different, it has to be said on this, from most other places. As in so many other things, Cambridge is perhaps a bit more like London now. And there is a huge generational shift going on. And the world we're going to live in 10, 20 years' time is going to be very, very different. And whatever the technology brings in terms of motorised vehicles, I think in terms of cycling, that is still going to be a fundamental and a liberating and freeing thing for many, many people. So I think you should be optimistic. I think the world is changing. I think where there are public servants who are clearly behaving improperly, then challenge it. I've always said that, you know, I'm a trade unionist. I believe in there being proper structures, proper rules, proper job descriptions, and when people break them, proper sanctions. That's the way you deal with these things. So if the bus drivers are a problem, let's go to the bus company and explain to them exactly what the problem is, and let's see if we can do something about it. And that's my pledge to you. So thank you very much for this evening. I have to say, I do find your monthly publication one of the essential reads. And you are very, very informative. And this very, very final point is I think it raises a big question actually about how our politics works in this city now. It's interesting, there's organisations like yourselves, Cambridge Ahead, interesting in the business organisation, that are coming up with policy ideas. And I think it says something about our politics and the political parties, that we've become very good at harvesting votes, less good at generating ideas and debate. That's something I think all politicians have to look at very closely. But in the meantime, you're doing a very good job. Keep it up.
Okay, I think unless any of the candidates have got anything they desperately need to add, I think we're going to have to call it a close there. I'd like to thank all the candidates for their time this evening. Thank you.